Hello, folks. Welcome to our webinar. It's good to see you here. My name's John. I run a company called Lab 539. And at Lab 539, we do two things. One of those things is we craft tailored cyber defenses for organizations. And that tends to take us into some quite interesting environments, OT environments, complex financial systems, supercomputers, like a bunch of really interesting tech. And also more general corporate environments as well. The second thing that we do, and we do quite well, is we track adversaries and we disrupt their activities. And it's this piece that I guess this webinar leans to today. And specifically, we're going to focus on the adversary in the middle tracking that we do. Before I go further, though, is the audio good? Can you see slides? Is everything working nicely your end? Nice one. Thank you. So we've been hunting down adversary in the middle infrastructure for probably maybe 18 months, perhaps close to 2 years now. And it started out as a bit of general research just to see how prolific the problem was. But this led us to a number of interesting discoveries that made it possible for us to detect this infrastructure with like a really high degree of accuracy. And in many cases, to detect the infrastructure before it was even weaponized. And over time, we've kind of evolved our coverage and we'll continue to do that as well. But for quite a while, we were just sat on this feed of interesting adversary infrastructure that was being spun up and we weren't doing a lot with it. And you'll see some of that in some of the earlier data that we'll touch on a little bit throughout this presentation. But essentially what I want to do in this webinar is very much take you through what we've seen over the course of 2024, because we've been collecting this data for more than 12 months. And okay, in some cases, a little bit blocky, but it's interesting to look at what's been going on. And obviously being still reasonably early in 2025, it felt like a good time to go back and reflect on the last 12 months or so. As kind of general admin side of things, what I prefer to do, if you've got any questions, just fire them in the chat. The chat's all private, so you won't see other people's questions. So if you do want to ask something, but you don't want people to see you asking it, you can do it there. And what I'll try and do is answer it as we go along, rather than necessarily stop at the end and go, any questions? But if you have questions that you want to fire at the end, go for that too. I do plan to share slides and also the recording of this at the end of the webinar. But most of this is based upon a blog post we put out a few weeks ago on the lab539.com website. So if you jump on there and jump into the blog, you'll see a lot of the kind of text narrative. It's just as we're writing it up, there were some areas that we thought, you know what, this could be a really long blog post if we delve into some of the intricacies. Not saying we'll delve into a bunch of boring stuff in this webinar, but there's some stuff that's better discussed than it is written down. So we'll delve into some of that. So let's get cracking. All right, so it's probably worth starting at the beginning a little bit. Like I say, we started hunting down this infrastructure because we wanted to better understand the size and scale of the problem. And one of the events that triggered that, well, we were seeing organizations having user accounts compromised, despite those accounts having MFA or two-factor authentication applied. And this was coming as a surprise to the organizations. They'd been sold the belief that MFA would prevent this from occurring. And what they were finding was they'd rolled out MFA to protect against yesterday's problem. They'd rolled out MFA that provided some form of protection against credential theft style attacks, whereby an adversary captures credentials, perhaps through a phishing website, and then utilizes those credentials in order to gain access to user accounts. But the thing is, the adversaries had already retooled. They'd seen MFA come in for years. The reason we weren't seeing MFA bypasses previously was not because they were a challenge for the adversaries. It was because, for the most part, MFA wasn't in use. So if MFA is not in use, we ain't seeing it being bypassed. Or if it is in use, they're not the victim organisations. It wasn't necessarily because MFA was a challenge for the adversaries. And what we saw was a lot of disappointed organisations who had invested a lot of effort into deploying the MFA that their vendors had recommended, only to find it was ineffective. And it was ineffective because it was designed to mitigate the credential capture problem. It was designed to mitigate yesterday's problem, not some of the challenges that we kind of face and see now. And don't get me wrong, there are some excellent phishing resistant solutions out there, but they weren't the ones that were being bubbled to the top and got widespread adoption. So we find ourselves in a situation whereby nothing's really changed from those previous attacks. And you'll hear us say this a lot, but adversary in the middle attacks shouldn't have been a thing. But they are a thing because of poor design choices made by certain tech vendors. They're a failure in terms of looking forwards. So a little bit like some certain ineffective MFA solutions out there, the topic of adversary in the middle does remain somewhat misunderstood as well. So I hate doing the whole introduction-y piece because I know most of you on this webinar know adversary in the middle stuff really, really well. But I do feel it pertinent to just briefly cover this before we go further. And the piece that I really want to get stuck in your brains is this real-time aspect to it. And that is that these attacks, they're occurring in real time. So when we've got the victim on the left who's got a nice Microsoft login page that looks authentic, but actually isn't, they've visited that site, they enter their username and password, and that gets proxied, sent to the adversary who sat in the middle. And whilst those credentials might well be being captured, the key thing here is that they're being proxied through the adversary's infrastructure to the site that's being impersonated. So in this case, we're using Microsoft. So Microsoft login page. And that's all happening in real time. So once the user enters their username, in fact, a good way to think about this is if you imagine the adversary's got a web browser that just replicates everything that the victim's web browser is doing. So when the victim enters their username and password and hits OK, the same thing happens in the adversary's web browser. So when that OK is clicked, that's when the MFA triggers. And in this case, we're using Microsoft Authenticator because it's one of the most widely deployed ones that I see. Well, what happens there? Well, when that's triggered, we see the MFA challenge happen. And how that typically happens with Microsoft Authenticator is you get your push notification. Well, this victim user is expecting that push notification because they think they're logging into authentic Microsoft website. So when they hit OK or enter the code that they've been displayed, nothing feels awry because that's what they're expecting. So the adversary doesn't need to do anything here. The adversary just needs to sit and wait for that to happen. And then once that's happened, that's the point where item number 5 on this happens. The adversary gets their session. And that's the thing the adversary is after. The username and password, they might be nice to have, but it's the session that the adversary wants. They want access to that user's session. Because without the MFA being circumvented, those credentials should be no good to the adversary. So once they've got the session, they've got all the access they need. And the thing to be a little bit mindful of this in this as well is the victim might well think they're logging into some, unimportant application. Might be some third-party application that's reliant on, in this case, Microsoft as their identity provider. So they're logging into third-party application with their Microsoft account. That's not necessarily what they're logging into, because the adversary can pick what they're choosing. They can pick the application ID that they want to authenticate this user to. So that third-party application that they think they're logging into, maybe that turns out to be Azure. maybe that turns out to be the Microsoft 365 world. So there's all of that complexity to kind of throw into the mix. So yeah, important piece here that I just want to stress is that real-time nature. This isn't adversaries capturing credentials to come back and use them later. This is adversaries sitting in the middle, capturing those sessions, and then piggybacking off and using those sessions. That's how they're gaining their access. Sat in the middle, in real time, doing their stuff. Right. So I mentioned we go out and hunt down this infrastructure. Here is an example of a record relating to that. And this was not actually from our 2024 data. This was something that came through in 2025 when we were busy putting together the blog post. So there's a whole bunch of different fields in here. We do our best to populate all of them, but because there's no cookie cutter template of what adversary in the middle infrastructure looks like, that's not always possible. There might not be a domain pointing to a particular piece of infrastructure and things like that. But there's two fields on here that I do want to particularly draw your attention to. They're kind of sat in the middle. One of them is front end and one of them is back end. So front end, if you think to the diagram we had in the previous slide, when we refer to front end, what we're talking about is the component of the infrastructure that a user might interface with. So in this case, that will be anything hosting that Microsoft login page that the user saw. That's what we consider the front end infrastructure. That might be different infrastructure, and often we see it is. That might be different infrastructure to the back end. And the back end is where the proxying happens and often where the authentication occurs from. So one thing that's essentially always the case when you look at an adversary in the middle attack, or a successful adversary in the middle attack anyway, is the authentication will be coming from a different IP address to where the user's present. That's a consequence of the proxying taking place. So it's why it's kind of important to distinguish between the front end and the back end side of things. Is kind of a good example. If you think something sat in Cloudflare, it's probably not hosted in Cloudflare, but that's where the user can see it as. That's the IP address space that it's sat on. And the back end's the stuff that does the hard work that captures and passes the credentials and captures their session tokens and things. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. I share that because whilst on the face of things, it feels really easy to just go through a ton of this data and draw out some stats and things. It's a lot more difficult than that, because we need to figure a way to get some consistency. So what is a piece of adversary in the middle infrastructure? Because if you've got multiple front ends and a bunch of back ends, is that one piece of infrastructure or is that 10? So the route we ended up taking to draw some of our stats, and this will be apparent in the next slide, is we took a combination of the domain and the IP address. And if we saw a unique match of those two, we considered it one piece of infrastructure or one record. So we essentially discarded the host name, because a lot of the time, if we see domains being used, there will be multiple host names associated with it. I didn't check how many were associated with this one, with this login yahoo.com instance, but in all likelihood, we'd see 5 or 6 different host names. And that doesn't really feel like 5 or 6 pieces of infrastructure. That feels like one. So what we didn't want to do was overly inflate stuff, because that doesn't really help in the whole analysis piece that we're doing. Right, so on to our first diagram. This graph shows the distribution of adversary in the middle infrastructure that we detected in 2024. So essentially, we're looking to see whether there were some months that were busier than others. And something I should add here as well is, for most of the first half of 2024, we were kind of operating in beta mode, and we added a good bunch more capability as the year went on. So with adjusted the data to accommodate that a little bit. But one month that obviously stands out here is February. And February stands out because it's very, very low. The reason it's very, very low in February is because that's when we did a whole bunch of dev work. So a lot of our kit was offline during February. But that aside, January still looks pretty hectic. And whilst January is the beginning of this chart, we'd been tracking for several months before January as well. And if we were to rewind a few months, January is still a spike in comparison to the Novembers and Decembers that came before it. The other month that obviously stands out is July, which was the busiest month we saw in 2024. And then things tailed off a little bit and then cropped up a little bit again in kind of October, November. But July was obviously the busiest month there. But we did want to delve into January a little bit because that looked somewhat like an outlier. And interesting. So when we put together this data, it was like the first week of February. So we already had our January data for 2025. So we compared January 2024 with January 2025. And interestingly, we saw for January 2025, we saw an increase of 50% on top of the busiest month of 2024. So a 50% increase from July 2024 to January 2025. So it does look like January, for whatever reason, seems to be a particularly busy month for Adversary in the middle infrastructure being deployed and stood up, which was interesting. That trend has continued in February. I haven't pulled the numbers for February yet. I probably should have done. We're kind of at the end of the month, but that's looked very, very busy too. So it looks like 2025 is going to be a bumper year, whatever happens. But for some reason, January does seem to be that month that's the busiest. It would be interesting to see if July is quite as busy in 2025 as it was in 2024. Who knows? I don't really know why that was a particularly busy month. We did trawl through the data and see if we could pick out anything particular, but it just looked like general Adversary in the middle infrastructure activity. I'd suspected the tail end of the year, so the Octobers, Novembers, Decembers, would be busier with, what campaigns targeting shoppers for things like Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff like that, but tended not to be. So yeah, that was the distribution per month. We then thought, well, is there any correlation on days of the week? The days of the week that were busier than others. And I don't know, like you look at the numbers and yeah, the beginning of the week looks a little bit busier. I think something we can definitely say is the weekend is quieter. Perhaps that's because for some operators, this is a bit of a 9 to 5. This is a job. So they're working hours. Perhaps some of it is because the people they're targeting are businesses and those businesses are more active during the week. Could be an option. I don't think there's a lot to draw from this from the weekdays, but I think we can clearly see there's a bit of a drop off when it comes to the weekend. So we then delved a little bit into hours of operation. And I was going to say this is an interesting one. I don't know if this is an interesting one. I guess the Monday to Friday nature of activity that we saw in the previous slide caused us to sit there and think, well, is there a particular time zone that it looks like the bulk of this activity is happening in? And like I drew a box around the busier period, which somewhat correlates with the working day in the Americas. But then that fires a bunch of other questions back, which is that busiest because it's people in America performing the attacks? Or is it busiest because there are a lot of attacks targeting America, and so it makes sense to be operating during their working hours? I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at that. One of those is this is us detecting infrastructure being stood up. What we don't do is detect campaigns being executed. So we're not seeing phishing emails or SMSs or anything like that being sent to entice users to, enter credentials and log into some adversary in the middle infrastructure. We don't have visibility of that. So that's not the stuff that we're detecting. So arguably, if you're deploying infrastructure, do you need to be working the same hours as your victims or your targets? Possibly not. But then if I think to how I would operate, when I kick off a campaign, I would probably want to be there when it started, just to keep an eye on things, make sure it's worked right, and watch as the sessions come in. I don't know. So there's a few ways of looking at that one, but equally, I also don't know if those peaks are high enough, because obviously there's massive overlap amongst timeframes, and maybe what we're seeing is the kind of overlap playing a part in this. I think one thing we can draw from this is 4 and 5 a.m. are pretty quiet times. The time zones on here, by the way, this time is all in UTC. So if you're in London, that's basically your time zone. And 4 and 5 a.m. would kind of correlate to working hours out in APAC. So I think we can say most operators aren't based out there if they are working hours. Excuse me. So I don't know if there's too much to draw from the time frame size of things, but one thing I had really wanted to do was take a look at the time between when a domain is purchased for using Adversary in the middle and when that domain is used in deploying infrastructure, and take a look at the difference between those side of things. And I guess the chart shows it all really there, that most of these domains are used within essentially a month, within 4 weeks of being purchased. And I think that was a little bit of a surprise to us. We'd expected it to be earlier. And I guess that's because we sit there watching this constant, like it's literally minute by minute feed of domains coming in that are being used within Adversary in the middle infrastructure. So it just felt like a very disposable thing. Domains are very disposable. Grab one, use it, burn it, move on to the next one. And actually that wasn't quite what was occurring. People were buying those domains and then they would sit on them for a little while before they'd deploy the infrastructure. And once they'd deployed the infrastructure, there was also a period of time before they executed their campaigns as well. Now, we don't know exactly what that period of time is, because like I say, we don't get sight of those phishing emails or the SMSs, or however the lure is delivered coming in. So we don't, like, we can go through and look at a few cases where we've seen things publicly reported or disclosed or whatever, but that's not enough cases for us to really draw a firm conclusion from. So yeah, domain purchase to deployment, typically within 4 weeks, maybe a few more days before the campaign was executed. It all kind of depended, but we're expecting more to be seen within days, which wasn't the case. But interestingly, when we did look at some of the excuse me, some of the kind of outliers, some of the domains, so you can see 7.1% existed for over a year before they were used. Typically, when we looked at those, they were domains that had been purchased for kind of user education type activities. They would be the ones that had the word phishing or something in the domain. I think we mentioned 1 or 2 in the report. One of them belonged to IBM and was clearly there for those purposes, and it was an IBM.net domain, so it had been purchased many years ago. But there was one that we mentioned as well that was particularly interesting, and this is where you can very much spiral into like a world of just interesting looking campaigns. But as soon as you start delving into them, you're like, you want to look deeper, you want to look deeper. And there was one we pulled out that looked really interesting because it was clearly very, very well thought out. And that was a domain that, how long ago was that? That was registered in 2001. So the domain was registered originally in 2001. It was used then for many years by a legitimate company who were in the real estate business. That changed hands in 2016 and then again in 2019. And when it changed hands in 2019, that's when the registration details were updated and falsely claimed to be the original registrant. Now, we weren't tracking activity around that time, but we did see that it had been used in 2023. And then in 2024, it moved to Cloudflare. And then we saw Adversary in the middle attacks relating to it. But the reason that was really interesting was the attacks, because we were tracking at the time, we captured a whole bunch of information, including some screenshots of some of the front end infrastructure. And it was very much targeting the real estate business. So this is someone who's thought about the campaign they're going to run. They've thought about the sector they're targeting. And what they've done is gone and bought a domain at auction that had previously been purchased that they knew would mean they've got some history. So they don't fall into that category of the domain having existed for less than a year, because this one now exists for more than 20 years. So well thought out one. But the thing with that is that's different to the vast majority of the infrastructure we see being stood up. That feels odd. That in my honest opinion, that feels like a red team that's executed a campaign, because red teamers have a habit of overthinking things, because actually their goals are slightly different to adversaries. Most adversaries, their goal is to spray and pray, hit a whole bunch of organizations and try and get in, rather than target that one individual. So that in all likelihood was a red team, or it was a very, very well thought out campaign. But the other end of the spectrum, if we look at the short time to deployments, what we were seeing, like we saw infrastructure being deployed within about 4 minutes of the domain being purchased. So there were some people who'd got really rapid and good at deploying this infrastructure. And we did look through a whole bunch of the kind of more rapidly deployed stuff to see if there are any correlations, see if there was a particular group who were deploying that stuff. And we couldn't see anything that stood out. It was a mix of different infrastructure and different things and different targets and the like. So we don't think that all fell into the hands of one group. But anyway, this was quite interesting stuff, and we'll definitely keep an eye on this side of things. I think we made the comment in the blog post that if you were to block all domains registered within the space of a year, then you'd have blocked 90% of adversary in the middle attacks. Obviously, you'd have blocked a whole bunch of other stuff that users and people legitimately want to access. But I think we've always had this thing in cybersecurity that you afford less trust to a newly registered domain. And I think that still holds true. Like, definitely don't go blocking all the newly registered domains. But if you're trying to make a decision as to whether that thing looks legit or not, then factoring the age of the domain into your calculation is probably still a reasonably decent thing to be doing. Right, hosting providers. So we've published posts on hosting providers before, and previously when we did this, DigitalOcean absolutely took the crown. They came out top as the preferred hosting provider for adversary in the middle infrastructure, and they've taken the crown again. And I was I surprised by this? I knew that they would feature strongly, because we look at this infrastructure, we see their name everywhere. But partway through the year, we added detections for Cloudflare that we didn't have before. And we saw our detections spike, like they went up a lot. In fact, in a previous post, I made the point that we turned those detections off for a period because we thought, well, this is too much of a spike. This can't be accurate. And then we trawled through the data, and it was absolutely accurate. Which is why I was expecting Cloudflare to be up there, but actually, through a quirk of the way we do a bunch of our detection, Cloudflare hasn't featured quite as strongly as it could have done, because whilst it's used quite extensively, Cloudflare typically only falls into the space of front-end infrastructure. It doesn't really fall into the space of back-end infrastructure. And if you're hosting Adversary in the middle infrastructure, you need the back-end infrastructure, otherwise you don't have Adversary in the middle. So whilst a lot of people will be fronting with Cloudflare, what we're really good at doing is detecting the back-end stuff. So kind of the combination of the two, like even if everyone hosted or used Cloudflare to front their infrastructure, Cloudflare would still never hit over 50% on this pie chart, because there's still got to be the back end piece as well. So I think that's done them some favors, but definitely an interesting one. And there were, like, these numbers are quite large when you add them up. So even some of the smaller slices in this pie chart, they did have a reasonably significant number of instances, number of records that we saw. But I think the thing that's always going to keep DigitalOcean up there is their accepting of crypto and kind of the ease of setting things up and spinning stuff up. Their pricing's not prohibitive and all of those side of things. So it works quite nicely for adversaries. I was surprised to see Microsoft so high, to be honest. Like, on one hand, I think if I was fishing for Microsoft accounts, I would host in Microsoft. But on the other hand, I just tend to have this view that Microsoft would be good at detecting when people are impersonating them. So yeah, to see them in 1, 2, 3, fourth place, I guess was a little bit of a surprise to us. But one name I would mention isn't on there, certainly in this pie chart you can see, is GCP, which is an interesting one. There's clearly stuff that's caused them not to be there, which is interesting. We did look at preferred hosting company. I won't dwell on this one because it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that the vast majority of the infrastructure is hosted in the United States. I don't think that's anything specifically related to US hosting providers. I think it's just that most hosting providers have a presence in the States, and that's their default location, and that's why that is. So let's move swiftly on from that one to our final chart, which is preferred domain registrar. Namecheap. It was Namecheap before, it's Namecheap again. I think there's again a crypto element here. The fact that they take crypto payments makes it handy for adversaries, because there's an element of anonymity to those payments. They're not shelling out from real bank accounts. There's no need to find, skimmed card details to make payments and things like that. So that's definitely a benefit. And I think that was true of, I'm not too familiar with NameSilo, but I think that was true of Hostinger as well. And I think I did briefly check NameSilo, and you know what? They were all, let's say, crypto friendly. So yeah, so like the Namecheap DigitalOcean piece is, if you're sat there working a defensive team and you want to just throw some metrics into the mix, they're probably good ones to use. Like, I wouldn't rely on them, definitely wouldn't rely on them. But if you're looking for something just to tip a balance in one direction or another, that combined with the age of the domain is probably a sensible thing to be looking at. So 2025. What do we expect to see? Now, I've already shared a little bit of this. We're seeing a continued upward trend in actually quite a relatively sharp rate. So yeah, we expect to see more of that. I think if you look at this from an adversary perspective, with everyone starting to consolidate or continuing to consolidate authentication into a relatively small number of identity providers, it makes it really beneficial for adversaries because they don't need to worry about cloning a million different websites to look legitimate when they're targeting you. Because if you're all using the same small number of identity providers, they just need to look like that identity provider, and that gives them a kind of massive target audience. So I'm definitely not suggesting you'll go vol your own authentication and become your own authentication provider. There's huge benefit to using someone who's dedicated and focused on doing that. But I do think it's worth being mindful of how you distinguish yourself or how you make yourself not that victim. Like rewind 5 years, and if you had MFA, you were in a better place than most. But now that's not good enough unless you're using something like passkeys or YubiKeys, things like that. So that could be the thing that elevates you, but maybe there's other things that you can use to elevate yourself and just not fall into that pool of being the same as everyone else, that campaign could also hit you as well. I remember 15 years ago, a colleague of mine performed what we'd now call an adversary in the middle attack in order to circumvent RSA, secure ID, two-factor authentication. All he did was created a website. When the user entered their details, he replicated it into his and passed it off to the site he was authenticating to, got a session back, and he was in. Right, that was 15 years ago, possibly more. So we knew this style of attack was a thing, was possible 15 years ago. So it's not that the technology doesn't exist to prevent it. It's that we're too focused on today's challenges. And when we go and try and solve today's challenges, the challenges that we see now, we're blind to the fact or ignorant to the fact that our adversaries are really good at evolving, and they're already probably one step ahead of us. So like I said earlier, adversary in the middle shouldn't have been a thing. Yeah, here we are. It needn't have been a thing. We knew this 15 years ago. So I think the worst thing we can do now is to focus on trying to solve adversary in the middle attacks. Like they're a means to an end. Our focus has to be on protecting our sessions, because that's what really matters now. The difficulty we have is that we're less able to do that than we've ever been, because we've handed control elsewhere. We've handed control to major tech companies, to SaaS platforms, to identity providers. So all we can do is utilize the controls that they provide us. And let's be honest, some of these tech companies, they're the companies that have just finished rolling out MFA solutions that are 15 years past their sell-by date. So I know that's a slightly glum thing to kind of wrap up on, but it is unfortunately the reality. So I think over the next year, over 2025, we're going to continue to see this. People have got themselves into a state whereby they went and did the hard graft to get MFA rolled out across their organization, and they can't go do that again this year because that project has been done, and to re-roll it again is a problem. So they're stuck with this inadequate MFA that's not suitable for today's challenges. But fortunately, there are some organizations who are in a better place. They've got good MFA solutions, or they've taken measures that mean they can roll out good stuff. I think there's still an element of setting yourself aside from others. How can you do the things that just make you that little bit more unique, that little bit more different, that little bit more difficult? How do you stay ahead of the majority? Because if you're ahead of the majority, you're not going to fall into that mass targeting space quite as easily. But yeah, like I say, when we're in a situation whereby we're just busy solving things that we knew 15 years ago, I think it's probably fair to say I'll see you again next year for our summary of 2025's Adversary in the Middle infrastructure. I can see a couple of questions, and I did answer one or two as I went along, and hopefully that slotted in nicely without me pulling out too much of the question. But let me read these ones that I've got here. Have you seen Adversary in the Middle being sold as a service? Yeah, 100%. Like there's a lot of that going on, and a lot of so the thing, without giving too much away, the thing that's quite nice when that's the case is you tend to have one set of infrastructure that's widely used. And okay, it's far more distributed infrastructure, but you've got a focal point to look at. And if you can find that focal point, you can do some stuff with it. The thing that we're seeing evolve an awful lot, though, is how that authentication proxying takes place. And that's a thing to keep a real eye on. If any of you are subscribers to our Adversary in the Middle feed, you'll have seen us add a few more feeds that aren't specifically Adversary in the Middle. And the kind of point behind that is it's all well and good detecting the back-end infrastructure, but if someone's proxying via VPN, SOX proxy, something like that, then we need to be passing you that information too. Because if you want to be blocking that, so yeah, there's a lot of evolution in that side of things. I've kind of gone off on a tangent from your question, but yes, absolutely, we see an awful lot of it. It's widespread. Why not pay someone a few quid to get them to deploy stuff for you, rather than you do it yourself? That way it's tried and tested, you know it works. You have some come back if it doesn't work. You have some anonymity because you're not the one having to stand up the infrastructure. Although on the topic of the infrastructure, one thing that I haven't paid any real attention to, but I do intend to, is back in the days of general phishing, we would see a lot of phishing infrastructure hosted on compromised servers. I have never looked to see whether the Adversary in the Middle infrastructure we're seeing stood up is being stood up on compromised servers, or whether it's being stood up on servers that have been spun up solely for that purpose. So that'll be an interesting one to look at and kind of see how that's evolved. Quick one for you guys. Obviously, we go out, we hunt down this infrastructure, we find it as early as we can, and we share it with people in our Adversary in the Middle feed. If you're interested in that feed because you've joined our webinar, you are very welcome to have 50% off your first month. Just use that code webinar24 if you want to use it. If you would be interested in using our feed as part of services you offer to clients or customers or whatever, then get in touch as well. We don't have information on our website for that type of thing, but it is a thing that we do. So feel free to get in touch. But what we've been very keen to do is to take advantage of features that exist in some of the major providers' tool sets. So conditional access policies and named locations and things like that. So ultimately what we do is give you data in a fashion that you can consume that. So we've structured things in such a way that you can subscribe to it, and what we'll do is constantly update those named locations for you, which means the data's there in your conditional access policies if you've created them, which means you've got real-time blocking of this infrastructure as we discover it. And that's becoming more and more prevalent, because if you were to just update on a daily basis, we're seeing several hundred new sets of infrastructure a day at least. So you might be too late on that stuff. So I think that real-time nature is important. And I mentioned a few other instances too. If you follow the news, you'll have seen that the UK sanctioned Z servers. who had a presence in the UK, which was X-Host's internet solutions. I think generally if the UK has gone and sanctioned a hosting provider, it might suggest that their infrastructure is often used in attacks. Maybe it's one to be blocking. You just turn that on. Similar theme with Stark. I know they've not been sanctioned, but we see an awful lot of nefarious stuff coming from their infrastructure, and the same with Tor exit nodes. Those are relatively straightforward feeds. The adversary in the middle one is the one that we go out and do the active hunting. So yeah, feel free to subscribe if you want a subscription. Feel free to give us a yell if you want to find out more, have a play, have a poke. Another question: how much indirect proxy adversary middle versus direct do you see? You know what? It really varies, and I think, although we've not specifically tied it to groups, I think it depends on the groups. I mentioned red teamers previously. There's one group that stand out like a sore thumb in all of this, and this is red teamers, because, like I say, they don't operate like your general adversaries do. So their infrastructure stands out a lot. So we'll put them to the side. When it comes to the other adversaries, it really depends. The SOX proxy stuff, we're seeing that ramp up quite a bit, which is why we've started mapping a lot of that as best we can, and we'll get that into a feed. In fact, there's a couple of feeds that we're planning in the not too distant future. One is SOX, and one is, I don't know what we'll call it, but live something or other, because a lot of the time we'll be sat there investigating infrastructure, and it doesn't necessarily fall into a category, but we know you'll want to be blocking it, or there's a live incident that we're dealing with, and it's almost like, well, we should probably share this with someone. Well, why not just share it with our subscribers? So we'll get those through. But the SOC stuff is increasing a lot. It's starting to lean more to the preference over VPNs, because you know what, we could quite easily add VPN lists and you could block those VPNs. But the SOC stuff is a lot more difficult to map and identify, because I mean, you can't just scan the internet and find it. It's residential IPs and stuff like that. So find a good residential IP coming from your country, and it's really difficult to flag that as being malicious infrastructure, because 90% of the time it's legit usage by legit people. So yeah, that's an increasing one. I couldn't give you stats though on exactly how much, and I know my view will be skewed on this slightly because I'm spending a lot of time at the moment investigating it. So as far as I'm concerned, everything is that at the moment, but it's not. We still see an awful lot of standalones. We still see an awful lot of stuff where there's literally one server spun up that does front end, back end, and the whole shebang. It just depends on how someone wants to do it, because it's easy to spin up one server, deploy your templates and hit go, and then when it's burnt, spin up another one and get going. When you start to span out to masking stuff in the back end, that's when you start to hit costs, and it depends whether the adversary wants to incur those costs or not, because we don't all have our own botnets and everything in play. But my prediction we'll be seeing more of it anyway. So hopefully that answers that question. Right, I think that's it. I think I've talked enough. In my mind, I was like, I'll make this 30 minutes, and I can see that we've now hit 49 minutes. So it's been a pleasure talking to you. Always happy to discuss adversary and middle stuff. If you've been doing some cool stuff and would love to collab or discuss, let us know. If you want to have a play with the adversary and middle feed, please do. It's been designed for techies and non-techies alike. So enjoy and have a look, and I'll maybe see you at another webinar or something soon. Have a good day.